Chairman. It is an honor to be here and be sharing with you my views on the situation as it is today. Each of us has only, I think, about this is it. Each of us has only a few minutes, I think about 10 minutes. So, of course, I have to choose the points and the arguments that I want to make. And certainly, the state of EU-Russia relations is serious. I believe that what the three of us understand is that the Russian regime is very much responsible for the deterioration of the relations, and mainly because of direct aggression in eastern Ukraine. And we believe that relations between the European Union and Russia cannot be easily restored, even if some form of a solution is found in Ukraine, because so much has happened, as Chairman Brok and Deputy Landsbergis just reminded us. The Russian leadership has drawn every single state in the European Union and the European Union as an institution in a major security crisis. And it took us some time to understand it. That is, that the Russian leadership transformed a political crisis inside Ukraine that led to the fall of Yanukovych and free and legitimate elections later in Ukraine, transformed that political event into a major security issue involving most of our governments and, of course, Ukrainians. So my argument is that the Putin leadership made the choice of going for security confrontation with us, that there is a preference in this leadership for confrontation over negotiation. And this is the biggest challenge for us, because Europeans and democracies are better equipped to negotiate, to find compromises, than to have to respond to confrontation and armed intervention, especially in a country, Ukraine, that is not a member state and for 25 years has been stuck between us, the EU, us, NATO. I'm speaking as a French citizen, and Russia. We have to see how we responded to this Russian policy. What are the lessons that we can draw from this first year of responses to the Ukrainian crisis, and take stock of, what the Russian government and army can do and maybe not do, and I will put emphasis on the costs of Russian intervention in Ukraine and destabilization in Ukraine. That is, try and show that one can easily write a narrative of the last year as a series of Russian victories, but one can also write a narrative of this last year as a series of Russian mistakes. If we take, of course, a different perspective and we try to do what the Russian leadership cannot do, but we can do, which is having a long-term perspective and a long-term strategy. But I know my friends and colleagues here will go also deeper into the way that the Russian leadership functions, and certainly we see that Vladimir Putin is more of a tactician than a great strategist. The lessons of Ukraine for us, Europeans and the EU, is that first, we did better than expected. Although we had not anticipated Russia's annexation of Crimea and further violence, and we had not expected Maidan and the quick fall of and peaceful fall of Yanukovych, and the capacity of the Ukrainians to go the democratic way with free and fair elections. Again, I'd like to emphasize the point that the Ukraine authorities did not want conflict, but that they had to respond to armed destabilization and armed intervention. We did better than expected because of the magnitude of the stakes of the challenge. I think the vote of sanctions in particular surprised the Kremlin. So there is something to be learned from that, is that when we can come up with a consensual and very clear and simple policy, it works. Russia acted illegally, badly. We can find ways, peaceful ways of expressing the EU and Western refusal of such methods. We could have done much better, however. Had we better understood already years ago what the nature of the Putin regime was, and that there were very few options for the Ukrainians to steer a peaceful way between still pleasing Russia but also trying to build a rule of law state and try to go towards prosperity rather than more and more impoverishment, which really was the case during the Yanukovych years. I think now, a year after Crimea, we, the EU, and our governments are stumbling again. There is a sort of fatigue of how to deal with Putin, which probably explains the Minsk II agreement. And I'm afraid that when we stumble and that we go back to old thinking, old fears, and incapacity. To avoid this, it is important to assess the situation and look at Russia's position not as a series of victories, and take into account the huge costs of the policy in Ukraine for the Russian leadership, the Russian economy, and the Russian population at large, which then will raise questions about the constraints that the regime may have in continuing a war in Ukraine. The costs of the confrontation we all know very well, the economic costs, which is not just sanctions, but of course is the legacy of years of dysfunctional economic policies, rent economy, and of course the oil prices going down a few months ago. But it is also the fact that Putin never reformed the economy and gave a preference to an authoritarian, non-competitive political and economic system. The diplomatic cost for Russia, we know Russia is much more isolated today than it was a year or two ago in most multilateral organizations. I think also that the costs are higher now for the Kremlin, because the Kremlin was banking on an easier destabilization of Ukraine and of the new authorities in Kiev, and that Vladimir Putin had to go for much more engagement, military engagement, than he had previously expected. So we need to discuss today what we believe are possible options for Putin, given the fact that he doesn't have infinite economic, political, and even military resources at home, because I think it's by rightly assessing the possibilities and capacities on the Russian side that we can better devise our responses and the influence we can have on the decisions made by the Russians, and also how we can devise our own policies. It seems to me today that the assessment is quite consensual, is that the nature of the regime in Russia is at the heart of the problem. That is, if Russia were ruled by a more democratic, more rule of law government, that Russia would have been able to accept Maidan, to accept the fall of Yanukovych, and a new, more pro-democracy, pro-European government in Ukraine. I would also like to say that what this last year has demonstrated, and I hope we don't forget this lesson too quickly, is that Ukraine cannot be a bridge between Russia and us. A big country like Ukraine, the population has made a choice in this last year, cannot be stuck between a revisionist, authoritarian Russia and the EU on the other. It is simply not a sustainable solution long term. And we should not go back to illusion that maybe Ukraine can be neutral, which really means dominated by the bigger neighbor. I think this is true also for the other in-between countries, the other countries of the Eastern Partnership. They are smaller, but the question of their security also is very intrinsically linked to their political regime and capacity for economic development. To conclude, in terms of propositions, I think in our minds we should be prepared to deal with very short-term and immediate challenges and decisions, together with long-term perspectives and forward strategy. We have to do the two together. That is, of course, continue to negotiate whatever can be negotiated with the Russian leadership, support Ukraine as much as we can, but at the same time prepare for a post-Putin Russia, because there will be a post-Putin Russia. It is difficult to know when and what it looks like, but I think the work that we can put in now to talk and reach out to alternative elites, to civil society, even if it's difficult, it has to be done even more so. So we don't let everybody in Russia be caught up in the hyper-nationalist spiral. I think we also need to think in terms of European security, very much so, and Putin has created the security crisis, so we, as the EU, I think, can take hold of this crisis, also as a security crisis, and work closely with other allies, with the Atlantic Alliance, with the United States, Canada, and all those other Western countries that have taken the same position so far when it comes to sanctions. And finally, I'd like to say that a big fight ahead is the fight against Russian propaganda, disinformation. We have to try and find ways of fighting back ignorance and propaganda. And certainly the European institutions can devise a policy in terms of counter-information. Thank you.